So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the human respiratory system. And so I want you to take a minute to think about what the function of the human respiratory system is. In other words, what service does it provide our body? And so I think the first one is fairly obvious. Most of us understand that when we inhale, we're taking oxygen into our body that our cells are going to utilize. But the other piece to that is that it also allows us, when we exhale, to get rid of that carbon dioxide, that waste product, when we break down food. So I want to talk a little bit more about, that food breakdown piece. And I want to make a point of differentiating between inhalation and exhalation with cellular respiration. Right? When we think of respiration, we think of inhaling and exhaling, but there's a little bit more going on at the cellular level that I think is important for us to talk about. And so I'm going to go back to the cell. So here we have a nice animal cell, and within each animal cell, we're going to find one or more mitochondria, right? And so we know from having studied the structure and function of cell components that this particular organelle is responsible for providing energy for the cell, right? It's the powerhouse of the cell. But how does it do that, and how is that related to the respiratory system? Well, let's talk about that. So the mitochondria is great because it really does unite our respiratory system with our digestive system, right? So at the cellular level, any glucose that comes from food, so the food that we take and we digest in our digestive system, is going to react chemically with the oxygen that we get from inhaling. And both of those are going to react together, combine in cellular respiration, ultimately to produce energy for our cells. But as a result of that, we're going to get some carbon dioxide and some water, right? And that's along with the energy that we want to produce, right? And so carbon dioxide and water are exhaled as waste. And so if you have ever, exhaled in the winter time, your breath probably looks a lot like that steam coming out of the kettle as the water condenses. And that's a function of that water that's a byproduct of cellular respiration. Okay, so cellular respiration involves inhaling and exhaling. The inhaling piece is where we get that oxygen, and the exhaling piece is where we get that carbon dioxide, which is a waste product and toxic to our cell, just out of our body. Okay, so now here are the reactions related to that. So if we were to write this as a chemical reaction, we would say, well, glucose from food plus oxygen that we inhale is going to produce a waste product, carbon dioxide, that we exhale along with that water, plus the energy that we're in need of. Now, looking at this from a chemical perspective, and when we convert those chemicals into their respective formulas, it's going to look a lot like this. Okay, and so this year we're not going to worry about that too much. This is a COVID year, but in other years I would be asking you to know this. Okay, so for this year I want you to understand this top one, but in a COVID year, learning remotely, this second one is the one that I really want you to know. All other years you would be expected to know both. All right, so now let's talk about that relationship between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. We've spoken about how digestion and respiration work together in the mitochondria, and now we're going to talk about how our circulatory system becomes involved. And so now we look at the lungs up here. And so we learned, when we learned about the circulatory system, about blood flow through the body, right? So when blood becomes deoxygenated at our cells, in cellular respiration, the blood then loses its oxygen, right? That oxygen gets used up in producing energy. So now our red blood cells are going to be devoid of oxygen, and they need to get more oxygen. And so that, by way of our veins bringing blood towards our heart, that blood is going to enter the heart, get pumped to the lungs, where it gets all nice and reoxygenated, and then it'll be able to be pumped back to the heart, and then with high pressure pumped through an artery out back to the body as reoxygenated blood. Okay, so our respiratory system has to be, it's a critical component of making sure that we're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so here's a diagram that you should have somewhere in the notes or something that looks fairly similar. And what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go through the important parts. But before we do that, what I'd like you to do is pause the video and try to provide labels for as many of the pieces as you can. And that will help to just internalize some of the ideas. So make some good guesses, take some good risks, and then we'll come together to make sure that you're on the right track, or maybe make some little corrections as we go. Okay, so I'm going to sort of start from, air going into your body to the point where it's interacting with your circulatory system. So I'm going to start up here. And so what are we looking at here and here? Well, we're looking at our nasal cavity and we're looking at our oral cavity. So we have our nasal passage or our nasal cavity and our oral cavity. And that is the place where we're going to take in air, and the important part of that air that we're inhaling is of course the oxygen. And then that air is going to pass through this passage here and down into here. And so first it hits what we call the pharynx, and the pharynx is another sort of fancy word for throat. And in grade 11 you'll break that down into subsections. It'll get a little bit more involved. But then of course air passes across our voice box, which has a fancy name, larynx. Right, and so where laryngitis comes from, that term, right? It has to do with, inflammation of the larynx, which is your voice box. Then as air moves down, it's going to move into this region here, which is covered by cartilage. It is called the trachea. I'm guessing maybe some of you were able to get that one. But then the trachea, further subdivides into a couple of different tubes, I'm going to say. Okay, but it's important to note that the trachea is covered by these rings of cartilage. In fact, if you go ahead and you feel that part of your throat area, you're going to feel some rings of cartilage. We're going to talk more about the function of that, but maybe in the meantime, you can think about, well, why might those rings of cartilage be useful to us? Okay, and so that trachea is going to branch off. There's going to be one branch going to the left lung and one going to the right lung. And remember, we're looking at this as it's another person, but remember the right in the mirror is going to be the left and vice versa. So right here, when I'm pointing to the right lung, it's actually the left lung on this person. And so those big branches are called bronchi. And so this is actually pointing to this right here as opposed to these two different ones. So I want you to think about, it really pointing to these two big branches going into each lung. Okay? And so those bronchi are going to, branch out even more into these things we call bronchioles. And so bronchioles are kind of like just smaller branches off of this big bronchus. Okay? All right. And so now, another thing I want to talk about is this structure that is just kind of, separating this upper body cavity called the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity below, which is the diaphragm. Okay, so that is the diaphragm, and it's involved in breathing. So let's get on to another diagram. Hard to show in the other previous diagrams, so I have another one here for us to take a look at. When I look at this, I want you to notice, first of all, here is the trachea. I want to situate us again. And so what are these things called again? Well, they're called bronchi. Okay, so one bronchus goes to the right lung, one goes to the left lung. Okay, here we have the lung. And so then we have these bronchioles, which are like the smaller little branches. Right, and then those bronchioles, what we didn't get to, and it's hard to see in the other diagrams, at the very end of them, can you see these sort of like grape-like balls, right? They look like a bunch of grapes. That, those are called alveoli. And so the alveoli are basically the site of gas exchange. And so I want you to notice, so this is an alveoli if we were looking sort of as a cross-section of it. And you'll notice that the alveoli are surrounded by this capillary network. Okay, remember capillaries are very thin thin diameter blood vessels with very high surface area. And what they're going to allow us to do is to efficiently exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So here we have one of the capillaries in that capillary network right here. And what we see here are some, blood cells that are moving along this capillary, and as they're going, they are gaining oxygen. Okay, so the oxygen is going to go from your trachea to your bronchus, through the bronchioles, right to the end, to the alveolus, and end up here. And so that oxygen that's in there is going to be diffused across that capillary and be taken in by our red blood cells. In the meantime, because of a pressure differential, carbon dioxide that has been carried by our red blood cells is going to have an opportunity to leave. Remember that materials always will move unless energy is applied from an area of, will naturally diffuse from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So if the CO2 is in high concentration here in this red blood cell, it's going to want to move to an area of low concentration. And it's the same with the oxygen. The oxygen is in high concentration during inhalation. We get a lot of oxygen in here. And so that oxygen is going to move from an area of high concentration to the cells where there is low concentration. Okay, so that is what is involved in gas exchange happening at the very end of these structures in our lungs that look like grapes called alveoli. There they are. Okay, so that's that. Let's move on. So this is another diagram kind of showing what is going on at one alveolus, which would be here. So this would be like that the inside of that grape-like structure, where we can see the oxygen is moving in, and our blood cells are going from being sort of like purpley to being red as they absorb oxygen, right? And they're moving along that capillary. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about the pathway again that our oxygen is going to travel as it moves into our respiratory system. So what I want you to do is to pause the video here and see if you can trace that pathway before we even go through it. You're going to get the most out of this if you take some time to kind of process what we've learned so far, and then we'll make corrections as we go. Okay, so pause the video, do that, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk through it. So I'm going to start with inhaled air that's going to contain oxygen. Where is it going to go first? Well, it's going to go either in our oral or nasal cavity. It's going to travel through our nasal cavity or oral cavity through the pharynx. The pharynx, remember, is that fancy word for throat. It's going to go to the larynx. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the larynx-pharynx passage in a bit. I'm just going to go through the trachea, all right, that cartilage tube. Then to the bronchi, one bronchus to the left lung, one bronchus to the right lung. Those bronchi branch off into those structures called bronchioles. In the bronchioles, and we could further divide bronchioles as well, but that's beyond the scope of this course. Bronchioles are going to eventually lead to those grape-like bunches called alveoli. Okay, now during exhalation, it's important to know that exhaled air would be moving in the opposite direction. So any air carrying that CO2 waste product of cellular respiration is going to be exhaled in the reverse order. Okay, so now I want to talk about the lining of our respiratory system. So the nasal cavity, this also applies to the trachea. What you're going to see here are, can see a bunch of different cells here. Here's a nucleus, right? I want you to notice these structures called cilia. Cilia are like small little hair-like structures. And so our nasal cavity and our trachea is going to be lined with these little cilia. And along with that, there's some mucus. Right, we know that our nasal cavity is lined with mucus. And so they have together a job to do. So, the cilia is going to have the job of basically sweeping out foreign material, right? It's going to kind of collect foreign material. So people who have smoked for a reasonable amount of time may have that sort of smoker's cough. They may have burned away some of that cilia, which makes it hard for them to remove some of the nasty byproducts of smoking from their lungs. Now, the mucus is really good because it's going to keep that surface area in your respiratory system super moist, okay? So in order for gas exchange to happen, the surface of our respiratory system needs to be moist. And we would have talked a little bit more about that had we done our frog dissections, but I'm going to talk about it here because it makes sense. Frog is an animal. So a frog has moist skin and really underdeveloped lungs. And so, you know, the reason the skin is moist is because the skin in a frog actually acts as part of its respiratory system. It is going to be having, it's going to have oxygen and CO2 exchange happening through the skin because the lungs aren't really strong enough to do the whole thing. Which is why it's important for you to be aware of that if you're handling frogs, that actually you're touching their respiratory system. Now, another thing that we missed this year, unfortunately, is the earthworm dissection. The earthworm dissection, also in talking about that, we would have learned that, you know, the surface of those earthworms are also moist, and that is their primary respiratory surface. And so it being moist is important for gas exchange. And it's why, you know, we see worms on sidewalks after a rainstorm, but then they suddenly sort of dry up and die once the rain is gone because that's concrete may not have the moisture that's needed for them to be able to respire effectively. Also, the sun might be drying that surface out. Okay. So another last piece I wanted to mention is that our nasal cavity, our respiratory surfaces, are lined with capillaries, and the capillaries are there to help warm the air that we inhale. And that just makes that process a little bit easier. If you've ever inhaled air on a really cold day, that can be kind of painful, right? So those capillaries are there to warm the air that we breathe in. All right, so I'm going to talk you through this, but at this point, if you want to simply take down the information, you're more than welcome to do that. I just want to go through the structures and provide more of a description for you in your notes, should you want it. And also, I want you to think about what you already know and sort of make guesses before I provide the description for you. So I'm hoping when you see the word pharynx that you think about that it's a special word for throat. Okay, so it's a fancy word for throat, but that's essentially what it means, and that's about where we're going to leave it this year. Now, the epiglottis is an interesting structure that I haven't talked about yet, but I've got a nice animation here that I hope will explain where it is and what its function is in the human respiratory system. So, what it is a flap of tissue that covers the trachea so that food does not enter when you swallow. So let's take a look at that here. I'm going to wait for this, this animation to start again. So you want to pay attention to this flap right here. And so here we have food going down the esophagus into the digestive system, which is what we want. But we don't want food going into the trachea. And this trachea is in front, esophagus in behind. We don't want food going down, quote unquote, the wrong tube. We know what that feels like. And so the epiglottis is this flap. And notice that the flap kind of moves down to cover the trachea as that ball of food moves into the esophagus. So the food goes down, the epiglottis covers this front trachea so that the food doesn't go down there. But if you're eating too fast or drinking too fast, sometimes some of that will go into the trachea, and that can be dangerous. In fact, if you drink and the food and that beverage goes down into the trachea because you haven't allowed the epiglottis to kind of become initiated, then you can drown. Okay, so now let's talk about the trachea. So I've isolated another picture here. Now, a lot of these little pieces here, you don't need to know those labels. You just need to know where the trachea is, and know that it branches off into the bronchi, right and left, one for each lung, right? But we know that it's a special word for windpipe. If you've ever had your windpipe kind of knocked, you know that that is quite an alarming feeling. And it's supported by those rings of cartilage that protects us, right? If we have our windpipe collapsing, that's quite a dangerous situation, because that's the means by which we take in oxygen that supplies oxygen to our brain cells, and we need our brain to be functioning so that the rest of our organ systems are able to work involuntarily, right, without us really actively thinking about it. So next we have our bronchi and our bronchioles, and I've put those together because they're in close proximity. So what I've got here, just to situate us again, is, this is the trachea, and what I've done is I've just kind of I've chosen a diagram where the lung tissue is kind of just isolated away, and we can see the bronchioles. So now, again, you don't need to know the primary versus secondary versus tertiary bronchi, though that's beyond the scope of this course. But you do need to know that that the bronchi branch off into bronchioles. Okay, so we have the trachea branching off into 2 bronchi, 1 for each lung, and the bronchi are going to just further branch off to form bronchioles. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk about the alveoli. So alveoli is the plural form of that. The singular form of that is the alveolus, 1 alveolus, multiple alveoli. And so at the end of a bronchiole, what you'll find are these little grape-like structures. You can see that there's a capillary network there, and that capillary network facilitates the diffusion of oxygen across the alveolar membrane and into our circulatory system. So the alveoli is kind of like the bridge between our respiratory system and the circulatory system. Right? So that's what they are, tiny air sacs at the end of the bronchioles. Lots of surface area. Why? Because we have tons and tons and tons of them. That allows for optimal gas exchange happening in our lungs. Okay, so again, they're surrounded by that capillary network, which is another feature that increases surface area, and that's where that gas exchange is happening. Okay, one last little bit. What are we looking at here first? Okay, I'm hoping that when you look at this, you can see that this is in fact the diaphragm. That diaphragm is that tissue right here. It's a flap of muscle. And we can see that we know, take a minute to breathe in, to inhale. When you inhale, I'm hoping that you recognize that your ribs are expanding. But when take a look at the diagram to see what's happening to the diaphragm when your rib cage expands, when you inhale. When I inhale, I can see that the diaphragm is actually moving down, right? So the diaphragm is essentially a large sheet of muscle underneath the lungs. And when we inhale, our rib cage is going to expand and the diaphragm actually moves down. And that's really just to make room for the extra air. If you're inhaling, your lungs are filling with air and that air has to go somewhere. There's only so much space here, right? So our ribs can expand only so much, but our diaphragm is muscle and it's going to have to move down to accommodate that extra air. Okay, when you exhale, the opposite is happening. You're reducing the pressure in your lungs. That's going to provide room for your diaphragm to again just relax and move up. Okay, so here's another diagram of that. Right here we can see that as you're taking in the air, that diaphragm is going to move down, and as you exhale, that diaphragm is going to move up again. So that's all we have today for the respiratory system. So look for some extra learning study tools for you to help you internalize some of these ideas. This is going to be particularly important for you if you're taking grade 11 biology, because you will be revisiting and expanding upon all of these ideas. So as always, if you have any questions, make sure that you reach out. I'll be happy to support your learning in any way that I can.